Hello again, everyone. It is Kevin Adkisson, your host here with Live at 5, coming to you on this beautiful, brisk spring day from the Frank Lloyd Wright designed Smith House. Today's tour, we're going to hit the highlights of this remarkable Usonian style home that was completed in 1950. It's been part of the Cranbrook family of buildings and museums, the Cranbrook collection, since 2017. The house was built by two school teachers in the city of Detroit, Melvyn Maxwell Smith and his lovely wife, Sara Stein Smith. And the Smiths, this was really their dream home. They worked incredibly hard to build this house. They sacrificed quite a bit in order to be able to live in a work of architecture by Frank Lloyd Wright. And I want to take us through the home today, explore the architecture of Frank Lloyd Wright, look at some of the highlights of the Smiths' art collection, and also learn about the family. Because unlike really any other Frank Lloyd Wright house that is out there and open to tours, the Smith House is unique for being only one family's home. We're going to see just the collections of Mr. and Mrs. Smith, and when they left the house, when Mr. Smith passed away and Sara moved out of the house, they did not take anything with them. And so we're going to see what it was like to be a mid-century modern architectural occupant, resident. We're going to see collections that were made at Cranbrook, and we're going to see works of art that were purchased from artists all around the country that the Smiths fell in love with, had to have, and then sacrificed so many things in order to fulfill this dream of building the Smith House. Now, before I talk, I'll talk more about the Smiths inside, but I want to introduce a little bit the man, the myth, the legend, Frank Lloyd Wright, America's most iconic and famous architect. When Frank Lloyd Wright designed this house, he was quite old. He was 79 when he designed this house in 1946. He visited the house 3 times in 1951, 1953, and 1957. And Frank Lloyd Wright at this point truly was America's most famous architect. He was born in 1867 in Richland Center, Wisconsin, and he died in 1959 in Phoenix, Arizona. And so his life spans from sort of Reconstruction all the way to the start of the conflict in Vietnam. And he started building buildings when he was just 17 years old. If you know Frank Lloyd Wright from the sort of mansions of Chicago, that is the Frank Lloyd Wright of very large homes for very wealthy people in the Gilded Age. That's the Frank Lloyd Wright where you see all of the stained glass windows and the custom carpets and the dresses that he would design for his clients' wives so they would coordinate with his home. And all of that architecture is being built in the 1880s, 90s, up to about 1909. And then Frank Lloyd Wright's career from about 1916 until 1936 completely tanks. And Frank Lloyd Wright is introduced at the Museum of Modern Art by Philip Johnson, his enemy, in 1931 as America's greatest 19th century architect. And what an insult that was. And Frank Lloyd Wright got to the podium of this museum that was promoting white walls and concrete architecture and steel. And he said, "Sir, you've mistaken me. I am not the greatest 19th century American architect. I'm the greatest architect of any place of any time. But this is someone who hadn't built a significant work of architecture in 20-some years." He built curious little structures in California, a hotel in Japan, and then was really struggling out in Wisconsin to rebuild his career. It all changed in 1936 when Frank Lloyd Wright built 3 very significant structures. The first was the headquarters of Johnson & Johnson Wax in Racine, Wisconsin, which revolutionized office and commercial architecture in the country. The next was Fallingwater, his most famous home, the house on the waterfall. That is truly when he outdid all of those German modernists and showed how concrete and flat roofs could be done with great soul and dignity. But the littlest project in 1936 is the most important one of our tour today. And that was a house for $5,000 for the newspaper publisher Herbert Johnson. And Johnson challenged Wisconsin's most famous son, can you build a little house for me and my wife and family, a house for the common man? And with that design for the Jacobs house, Frank Lloyd Wright coined the house Usonia 1. It was his borrowed abbreviation for United States of North America. And Usonia 1 was Frank Lloyd Wright's entry into the small house problem. And it was a moment of coming out of the Great Depression, of a great housing crisis in the country. And so architects were concerned with what is an American house going to look like. And Usonia 1 would feature many of the same aspects that we see in our house, which is called a Usonian style home. These Usonian style homes for the everyday man are often made of wood, occasionally concrete block. This is actually the last wooden Usonian house that Frank Lloyd Wright builds. Then they're made of brick, concrete, which is what the house is sitting on, and glass, which is the windows. There's no plaster, there's no paint, there's no material that is sort of untrue. The house's structure is the wood, and you're seeing the wood. The house's load-bearing walls are the masonry, and you're seeing the masonry. Frank Lloyd Wright hated artificiality in materials. And he called his architecture more generally organic architecture. And you can see how the house is really situated in the landscape. It's buried in the hill on one side. And then Frank Lloyd Wright loved the prairie, but when he doesn't have a prairie to work with, you can see that he builds this horizon line using the brick wall. The house then pops up from that horizon line. It becomes two long lines looking over the horizon, and then you see how the junipers pick up the same line, and here there is a low ridge, and so Frank Lloyd Wright has the horizon line. And if you know much about his drawing style, you know that he would start illustrating his architectural works with a sheet of paper on the drafting board, do a thin, harsh line to mark the earth, and then the building would entirely be rooted in that line. And so here in the landscape with the brick wall, the juniper, and the hill, he has that horizon from which the house pops out. Now, I'm here in Bloomfield Township, about a little over a mile from Cranbrook's main campus. The Smiths bought out here because they could not buy elsewhere. They were school teachers, they had no money. Frank Lloyd Wright sent them out and said, go and buy a piece of property that no one wants, because that means it will have an interesting feature in the landscape, and I'll be able to respond to the landscape. The interesting feature here was the little marsh behind the house. And they sent a topographical map to Frank Lloyd Wright, who designed the home. World War II interrupted, and in 1949 they begin construction, and in 1950 they move into the house. But where did they move into? Where's the front door? Frank Lloyd Wright was interested in Japanese architecture after he visited the Japanese pavilion at the 1893 Chicago World's Fair. He visited Japan again in 1905, or for the first time in 1905, lived there in the 19-teens. And so like a Japanese house, he squeezes us in, he hides the front door, and you turn a corner and you're compressed down. Now, as we turn the corner, I have to point out Frank Lloyd Wright's signature, this little red tile with the FLLW. Inspired again from a Japanese tradition of woodblock prints, where the Japanese printmakers would press their engravings with a red block to mark who the artisan was. And Frank Lloyd Wright would give these tiles only to those houses he thought realized his vision. Now, we move into the house, and we are still compressed under the roof, and then bam. The entire landscape opens out in front of us in what from the outside seemed to be an almost comically closed off billboard-like wooden structure is this open, light, glassy home. Now, Frank Lloyd Wright didn't like glass boxes. He thought there was no reason to pretend that you were living outdoors. And so instead of feeling like what you might see in California with a glass box from the Eameses or the Neutras or even Eero Saarinen, our house has this real sense of embrace, that we are the sort of pearl in the oyster of the Frank Lloyd Wright home. And so the landscape is brought in visually, but you also feel incredibly sheltered. And that goes down to the brick and the wood and the materials that are used in the house as well. Now, how did the Smiths get interested in Frank Lloyd Wright? Mr. Smith was born in Detroit in 1914. He was born in Detroit in 1914. He was one of many siblings. He wanted to be an architect, but it was the middle of the Great Depression when he graduated from Northern High School in Detroit. And so his family had already sent his brother Marty to the University of Michigan to study dentistry, and they couldn't afford to send Melvyn off to Michigan as well for architecture school. So he planned to study 2 years at Wayne and then transfer to Michigan. In his first year at Wayne, he had an English professor who changed his life, introduced him to transcendentalism and also the power of education. And so Mr. Smith became a high school teacher. He taught 38 years high school English at Cody High School in downtown Detroit. He went back for his graduate degree at Wayne, and he had to take an art appreciation course. And up on the screen flashed Frank Lloyd Wright's newest wonder, Falling Water. And Mr. Smith jumped out of his seat and said, "I will build a Frank Lloyd Wright house." And everyone in the room sort of laughed at him, because here they were in Detroit studying to be school teachers. They would never be able to afford a Frank Lloyd Wright house. Mr. Smith, though, did not let go of that dream. He met his wife, Sara, in 1937 at the Benai Sunday School. And he fell in love with Sara. She wanted to be an actress, but she, too, was teaching school. She taught kindergarteners auditorium. They fell in love, and I can just picture Mr. Smith saying, all I need in the world is you and a Frank Lloyd Wright house. And Mrs. Smith, Sara, said, "All I need is you. Who's Frank Lloyd Wright?" She was brought into the journey, and in 1940 they were married. In 1941 they honeymooned at Lake Louise in Banff, Canada. On the way to Canada, they stopped in Spring Green, Wisconsin. They saw Frank Lloyd Wright's sign, Taliesin, and thought, let's drop in and visit and just see how close we can get. What is there to see here? Unexpectedly, they run into an apprentice and they say, we can't build it now. We don't have any money, but we want to have a Frank Lloyd Wright house. And the apprentice says, it's before dinner. Maybe he'll see you. They get picked up in a Jeep, whisked off to Frank Lloyd Wright's studio. He falls in love with them as clients, mainly because he can tell they're going to do exactly what he wanted. And that was his sort of number one rule as a client, was that you got the house Frank Lloyd Wright said you got. And so in 1941, they had established a relationship with Wright. 46, they bought the property, sent him the topographical surveys, and in 1949, took the plans out to contractors. And this was going to be a house for $8,000. But the house for $5,000 in 36 had inspired them. Frank Lloyd Wright said, it's a little later, it'll be $8,000 or $9,000. They took it to the contractors they wanted to use, and they all said, $20,000, $25,000, and we'll have your house. And the Smiths wrote to Frank Lloyd Wright and asked, how are we supposed to build this? It's too expensive. And Frank Lloyd Wright said, you want to be an architect, Mr. Smith? Build it yourself. And so Mr. Smith, seen here with Sara, his wife, and their son Bobby, studied the blueprints. He went to the library. He read about the building trades. And then he and Mrs. Smith served as their own laborers and their own contractors. And they used young workmen who wanted to be involved on a Frank Lloyd Wright house to come here after their day jobs and help work and build the house. Now that we know a little bit more about the Smiths, I want to share a couple of stories about how this house is built. And we'll start with the brick. Frank Lloyd Wright specified a more expensive red brick, but Mr. Smith, ever wary of the budget, he was making $35 a week as a high school teacher, said, "Mr. Wright, can I substitute your more expensive brick with this cheaper brick that's used for retaining walls?" And Wright said, "It's the right shape, it's the right color, go ahead." But notice the way the bricks are laid, where you have these horizontal mortar lines that are incised, accentuating that horizontal line of the Smith of the whole house. And then the vertical mortar lines are flush with the bricks here. So when you see the brick wall from afar, you can just see those shadows being much accentuated because of the mortar line. Now, the fireplace packs a lot of architecture into a cheap house with this beautiful cantilever, simply meaning only supported on one end. And the cantilever here is actually supported by a steel rod that is holding a steel plate. And the weight of the back of the fireplace is stacked onto this steel rod, and then the weight of the front of the fireplace is counterbalanced. As they were constructing the fireplace, Mr. Smith, I don't know how high it was when he realized this, but at some point he realizes it was an inch off, and he tells his workers, "We've got to tear it down and start over." And they say, "Are you serious? You have no money? We're working for practically nothing. You want to tear this down?" And Mr. Smith says, "We have to. This is a living work of art." So he very much was going to have this perfect, not even an inch off from what Frank Lloyd Wright designed. The next material is the wood. This is tidewater red cypress. It grows on the coast of from Florida up to North Carolina and Virginia. It was actually a protected species by the time between the 1946 design and the 1949 construction. So Mr. Smith had to drive to Florida and try and buy backstock of the wood. It was the only wood that Frank Lloyd Wright wanted to use for his wooden houses because it has this gorgeous golden color. It gets harder the longer it's exposed to oxygen, and it's essentially rot-proof, bug-proof. It's really indestructible. And behind this wall, there is no stud work. There's no beams. These are sandwich panels. So picture one piece of wood here, a piece of plywood in the center, tar paper, and then a piece of cypress on the other side, and it's screwed together from both sides, and it makes a sandwich panel. And that panel is providing all of the structure, which means that these bookcases are the lateral bracing. So these are the top of your I-beam. If you think of this as a giant wall that is also a wooden beam, these bookcases are providing the structural reinforcement. Now, the bookcases also had a dual purpose, which was that Frank Lloyd Wright felt his clients, generally all Americans, had terrible taste in art, and so he wanted to make it impossible for you to hang tacky oil paintings or otherwise sort of derivative art. Instead, he thought you were more likely to get beautiful handmade ceramics and pottery, and so if he only gave you wall space with bookcases on it, you could only collect what he thought might be nice. Now, the last material, or the two remaining materials, are the floor, the concrete floor. Underneath this concrete is a layer of sand, then gravel, then copper pipe, and on top of the copper pipe, they poured a concrete floor that was then scored with a 2-by-4 foot grid. And this is the grid that Frank Lloyd Wright designed the whole home on. You'll see how the house lines up with the concrete line there all the way to the ceiling. If we come over to the bench, you can see how the bookcases are then on the 1/2 4-foot marker, but the cushions, even the wooden seam here, lines up to the grid. Now, those copper pipes that are cast into the floor are then heated in the winter with a hot water that runs back and forth, and so all of the heat for the house comes from warming up the concrete mass of the floor. There are no radiators, there's no forced air circulation, it's just a warm floor. And there's no insulation in the walls, and these are single-pane glass windows. Surprisingly, the house is too hot, not too cold in the winter. Now you'll see that the 2x4-foot grid extends all the way outside. And so you have these 2-foot French doors that when they're open, the 2-foot French door fits on the 2-foot portion of the grid and gives us a 4-foot opening. The last material is the glass. I already talked about how Frank Lloyd Wright didn't want to build a glass box, and so he creates this beautiful syncopated rhythm of 2-foot French doors, 4-foot plate glass at the corner. There is no corner mullion, and so the whole house sort of disappears, almost like a Japanese tea pavilion, because the corner is not blocked by a column or a window frame. And those are just pieces of glass butted together. There's a little bit of caulking in there, but it's just essentially a pressure fit glass corner. The glass windows themselves then repeat with the clear story designs here that bring in the soft light over. Mr. Smith had largely finished construction in 1950, but he did not have enough money to buy the glass windows, so he bought plywood to board up the house. They could move in a little bit later. They had lived in Detroit public housing before this, and then were living with their family, some of their siblings, to save money as they built the house. And he thought, I only have $500. I'll save money for the glass, and we'll move in the next year. When a young man stopped by, said, I'm so interested in Frank Lloyd Wright. I love this screwy house because it's made of screws, not nails. Why aren't you moving in? You're so close to done. And Mr. Smith explained the problem of the glass and the $500 would never buy the thousands of dollars of glass he needed. And the young man said, let me help you out. I can get someone to come and measure and we'll work out a price later. And Mr. Smith says, okay, but I really don't have much money. The measurement gets taken the next Monday. A couple of weeks after that, the windows are being installed. Mr. Smith goes to his mailbox. He has a bill. It's for all of the glass, exactly $500, and it's signed A. Alfred Taubman. And Taubman was just at the beginning of his career before he would go on to become one of America's largest mall developers, the owner of Sotheby's, and the donor of many different cultural institutions here in Michigan. So now that we know a little bit more about construction, I want to take just a couple of minutes more in the living room. I know you're dying to see the rest of the house, but we have to talk about some of these art objects because once the Smiths move in 1950, they have nothing. They have 4 folding chairs, a bed for them, a bed for their son, their young son, a folding table, and that's it. There's no cushions. There's no Frank Lloyd Wright furniture. And Sara Smith describes that moment as when the house became her stage. She had wanted to be an actress, and now she had her stage to live in. It was, I think, the happiest they had ever been. Mr. Smith was in his late 30s, Sara in her early 40s. But they began as they paid off the labor who had helped them build the house. The furniture by Frank Lloyd Wright was donated, constructed and donated by their siblings as a gift for the 1-year anniversary moving in. And they began going to art galleries and shows and meeting with artists, a lot of them from Cranbrook. And they began buying art. And at first, they only bought what they could afford. And then they met an artist who said, I'm not going to give you a cheaper price, but you can pay me in installments. And that's how they start buying en masse around the late 60s. Urban Japina, a 1970 graduate of Cranbrook, wove this piece shortly after he graduated under Robert Kidd. The Smiths paid him in 4 payments of about $200. Which he said is what he survived on as a young artist weaving in Detroit. And after he brought the piece over to the house to deliver it, the Smiths loved to have the artist place the work in the house, but there was no place for this huge tapestry. And so he rested it on the piano, and Mr. Smith said, perfect, it's a piano cover. Can't you make it bigger? And so Urban Japina did. He wove additions to the piece. You can see his signature there. And if you look at the design of this additional border that moves around, there are 4 different color schemes with the copper inlays. But this design is coming from Frank Lloyd Wright's design for the clear story windows. And windows like this are part of every Usonian style house by Frank Lloyd Wright, and every window design in the about 200 Usonian houses is unique. Now, other artisans that they supported included James Masana from the University of Detroit Mercy, who has multiple pieces and who really viewed Mrs. Smith as a mother figure. Then there are pieces by Maya Grotel, who was Cranbrook's famed head of ceramics, the Finnish immigrant. This is one of my favorite pieces, this little vessel here, also one of the earliest pieces. It's been here since the 1950s. And then, of course, there's the hi-fi, which they would use to play all of their hundreds and hundreds of records that they had stored in the house. A portrait bust of Mr. Smith by Robert Sheffman, cast by James Masana. Those stained glass windows are not Frank Lloyd Wright. Frank Lloyd Wright does not design a stained glass window after 1916, so that's another art piece placed in the house. I want to move now into the dining room, but as I move, the house does look mighty empty today. When the Smiths lived here, by the time it got to 1984, which is when Mr. Smith passed away, this room was chock-a-block full. There were two couches, 2 club chairs, 2 sitting chairs, and 2 coffee tables, as well as the 6 hassocks and the 40-foot couch. None of the couches survived. Mrs. Smith, I think, actually got rid of some of them. It was crowded. And then the coffee tables are at the wood restoration shop, awaiting varnish to get unfrozen during this crisis, and we'll have the restored coffee tables back. In the dining room here, we can see Frank Lloyd Wright designed furniture. He called these his butterfly or origami chairs. You can see why. They have the splayed back, 3 legs, 1 large front leg and 2 back slats or legs with the red cushions that were recently restored. Barbara Wittenberg wove the tablecloth. She also wove much of Mrs. Smith's clothing. Mrs. Smith had a degenerative disorder, and so she was only 5 foot to begin with, and she got shorter over time. And so Mrs. Wittenberg not only wove this tablecloth, but then wove much of Mrs. Smith's clothing or altered it. The dishes are Russell Wright. The table itself is in 3 parts. We're seeing 1 here. It's standalone leaf. 2 here, and we'll see the 3rd a little bit later in the tour. The Smiths would move the table throughout the house, and they would use it in the living room. They would use it in the garden. This is one of my favorite views of the house when you have Frank Lloyd Wright's lovely ceiling illuminated running across the dining room, and then the clear story with the same pattern behind it. Frank Lloyd Wright, his houses are short, the Smiths were short, he was short, but that has very little to do with the fact that these ceilings are 6'1". Frank Lloyd Wright brings the ceiling down when you're having an intimate dinner or sitting on the couch. He raises the ceiling up when you're having a function, a dance, or a concert in the living room. And then he raises the ceiling to its highest level, 14 feet, in the kitchen where you're cooking and things are hot. The screen that divides the kitchen and the dining room has a sculptural assemblage by Glenn Michaels, who is a 1958 graduate of Cranbrook. He is still working in his late 90s, and this is made out of found objects. Frank Lloyd Wright had a graphic designer, Eugene Masselink, who designed much of his own patterns and doors. Mr. Smith attempted to hire Masselink, but he got there too late, and Masselink had already passed. And so he commissioned Glenn Michaels, who was known for his architectural sculptures, interventions. And so this is directly on the Frank Lloyd Wright screen, and it's made out of broken bathroom tiles from the salvage yard. These are old electrical switches from a piece he did for Connecticut General Electric. Then there are pieces of old type, and then there are these pieces of cast bronze that he would sculpt in clay and other found objects and send to Canada to be cast. Behind it is the kitchen. It's a very efficient layout. Frank Lloyd Wright would have not called this a kitchen, but a workspace. Kitchens implied you had a staff. Mrs. Smith did not have a staff. You see the open shelving here. Ahead of his time, Mr. Wright. The cabinets are 5-ply maple plywood. and they're held in place using piano hinges. And so this piano hinge is keeping the plywood from becoming misshapen. It's also establishing long lines instead of interrupting his beautiful woodwork and clean lines of the house with heavy hinges. The cabinet, the countertops and the appliances were replaced in 1973. Mrs. Smith was a gracious and wonderful host, but she was not a cook. She once attempted to serve Mr. Smith's army officer a frozen roast. And so after that ambitious early project early in their marriage, she became famous for her Campbell's soup lunches with grilled cheese. Serving one hot dog to you for dinner while she and Mr. Smith split a hot dog is a story I heard. She always served white grapes when you were at the house, and then sickeningly sweet tea with lots and lots of sugar. I've had multiple visitors come and tell me, oh, you ate before you came to Mrs. Smith's dinner parties. They also had so many siblings, and so they would travel around and eat there. A way to save money. This is Mrs. Smith's study, a bust of Frank Lloyd Wright. And even though this room is only 8 by 8 feet wide, she had in here her chair, her red telephone, where she would call her sister Thelma 7 times a day. She called most of her siblings and her family every day, if not multiple times a day, and wrote them almost every day. She also had a desk, she had her books, and she would sit almost nest-like underneath this magical skylight where she could see the oak trees up above. And Frank Lloyd Wright has the natural light coming in through the clerestory, electric light ringing the skylight, and then almost like a Roman impluvium, this opening towards the sky. And so instead of just having the skylight, Frank Lloyd Wright heightens the drama of moving from this brick cube up towards the heavens, and it becomes a crown on this really intimate, beautiful study. There is art everywhere in the house, on every single surface. The bathrooms have their original appliances to 1950. And then as we move into the guest room, we're coming across some family photos. It is just a 2-room house. There were originally 3 bedrooms, but one was converted, as we'll see. There's Mr. and Mrs. Smith. Here we have Frank Lloyd Wright on one of his 3 visits to the house. Frank Lloyd Wright is seated with Mr. Smith. He has just signed the guest book, which we have in the archives. And there is the 3rd Mrs. Wright, Olgavana Wright. There are Mr. and Mrs. Smith and their grandchildren, Jennifer and Michael, and their daughter-in-law, Anne Fuchs, who is a grandniece of Albert Kahn, the architect. And here is around the time of the wedding, Mr. and Mrs. Smith with Anne and Bobby, their son. And Anne used to teach at Brookside, Cranbrook's elementary school. Now, Mr. Smith passed away in 1984. He was only 70 years old. Sara outlived him. She lived until the age of 99 in 2005. And Bobby sadly died of an illness before his mother in 2003. He did help to establish a foundation to manage the house. And then through Anne's leadership, as well as through the contributions of niece and or nephew and niece-in-law, Marvin and Dory Schwedel, the house was maintained for many years and open to the public before Cranbrook had it. But Anne and her second husband, Michael Tobes, generously helped restore the house around 2009 and then gave the house to Cranbrook in 2017. And there you see Anne and Mr. Tobes. So we are incredibly grateful to Anne and Michael for preserving this remarkable house and for gifting it to Cranbrook. Now, Bobby Smith was an artist in his own right, though he studied law and went into law and communications. This is one of 2 paintings that Bobby Smith did. This is 1970. He was also an Eagle Scout, which he did with his father. Now, I want to pause back here at the bathroom just to show you the thinness of the house. This is the thickness of interior and exterior walls throughout the home. So this is that sandwich board of cypress, plywood, and cypress. And how the house keeps from blowing over are all of these turns. So if you think of a paper fan, when you fold the paper fan and it becomes stronger, that is what Frank Lloyd Wright is doing with the walls. And here again, you see the way that the shelves are forming lateral bracing. And so the shelves move straight through the house and become the linen closets when they're given their little plywood doors. Now, next is the master bedroom. This was originally Bobby's room, but when he went off to the University of Michigan, he said, you know, I sacrificed vacations, eating out, having toys. I had to pick up pine cones. I am not coming back to that Frank Lloyd Wright house. Who knows how serious he was, but his parents did renovate, change the layout somewhat, and Bobby lost his bedroom in favor of his parents. They also had their own small bathroom back here, which you'll notice it does have a shower head. Frank Lloyd Wright thought showers were uncivilized, and so the Smiths only installed this shower in 1959 after Frank Lloyd Wright had passed away in 93, and they knew he would not be coming back to visit the house because you never knew when Frank Lloyd Wright was going to drop by, and the Smiths were not going to disappoint him by having taken such uncivilized showers. I can only imagine what Frank Lloyd Wright would think of what happened to the house as it became filled with objects. It is sort of Frank Lloyd Wright's nightmare, but what a reflection of the Smiths' dream and their own really beautiful taste in art and objects. Now, this was the original master bedroom. When it was a master bedroom, there was a solid wall here. Every time you see this pattern running vertically, that's a 1968 addition to the house, designed by Frank Lloyd Wright's head partner, William Wesley Peters, and one-time son-in-law. We can see here what the house looked like before the renovation. So we're in this room here, which was very much closed off as a bedroom, and then it was opened up into a little sitting room. The lights in the corner are Frank Lloyd Wright's design from the mid-1930s, designed for his own Hillside School Theater. And then Mr. Smith purchased the design from Taliesin and installed these in some of the rooms in 1968. The Smiths also had a much larger big screen TV back here. I love this television because so much of Cranbrook is really high design at enormous expense, at beautiful craftsmanship. And the Smiths were really just everyday people. And so we see in this house, unlike Saarinen House or Cranbrook House, where you have really exquisite collections of incredibly fine decorative arts. At the Smith House, it's a combination of custom works of art and then mass market items. And so here you have a television on a plastic stand that is clearly inspired by Eero Saarinen's pedestal tulip furniture of 1957, but now taken to sort of Sears' catalog. And that extends to how they would combine custom weavings from Cranbrook by Urban Japina with then plaster reproductions from the Metropolitan Museum of Art from Auguste Rodin that they would purchase from catalogs. Very interesting sculptures all around the house. Dory Schwedel told me on her last visit to the house that she brought this here. On her first visit. This is their nephew's wife, and she had no idea what she was getting into, and she was so embarrassed that she brought a pot to these people when she saw how much they collected, and she thought they must have hated what I gave them, and so she always knew that she had been sort of brought into the family because that pot was always left out on display in a pride of place. And they did get lots of visitors, lots of guests. Mr. Smith's least favorite thing was to wake up or come home and see fingerprints on the glass windows, because that meant that someone had come by the house and wanted to see in, and he wasn't here to give them a tour. He gave so many tours. Many of you who were students of his will recall that he talked about this house constantly. At the 50th reunion of his English class last summer, I asked what was Mr. Smith's favorite thing to teach, and uniformly, they said his own house, and then Shakespeare. But Mr. Smith loved showing this house off, and so it's a real gift that we're able to continue that legacy now at Cranbrook. Now, this is the 1968 garden room. It's an addition to the house. Perhaps if you come on a longer tour, I can give you my own thoughts about why they did this, but I think at the most basic level, this is the most conventional room in the house, the most conventional proportions, the most conventional seating arrangement, and I really think it functioned as a den for the family. It does have these funky Naugahyde plastic couches, and then it has two really significant works of art. The Leaping Gazelle by Marshall Fredericks, who was an instructor in sculpture at Kingswood School for Girls at Cranbrook and an assistant to Carl Millis. Those of you from the Detroit area, you know Marshall Fredericks from his Spirit of Detroit in downtown, or his Flying People in Cheyne Park in Birmingham, or his Flying People in downtown Royal Oak. And then the Leaping Gazelle is resting on this really remarkable work of iron by Paul Evans, who studied at Cranbrook in the early 1950s from Pennsylvania, worked in New York. And this is all made out of painted, wrought and forged iron. And then it has on the interior a rosewood interior with some of the Smiths' audio equipment as well. Behind it is the glowing Moses with his 10 Commandments. The Smiths were both born into large Jewish families. Mrs. Smith, her parents had immigrated from Lithuania in the 1880s from an Orthodox Jewish community. They both did convert, Mr. Smith to Transcendentalism, and Sara Smith became a Christian Scientist. The plants here, there are some photos around 1968, 1970 showing live plants, but for the most part, the photographs show these permanent botanicals. So the next time someone says, "Is that real?" say, "Yes, it's a real permanent botanical." A sculpture by James Searles there. So I want to conclude our tour. We have seen the full 1,800 square feet of the house by going outside. The terrace was redesigned as part of the 1968 edition. But after Mr. Smith had this house, he began shaping the landscape. The first pond that he dredged, he used just a rowboat and his nephews to help turn a marsh into a little pond. But then he said, "I have a house by the most famous architect in the country. I need a yard by the most famous landscape architect in the country." And to Mr. Smith, that landscape architect would have been Thomas Dolliver Church. And Thomas Church was a Berkeley-based architect, part of the school with Lawrence Halprin and Charles Moore and Joseph Eschrick, the Bay Area school of the 1950s and early 60s. If you don't know the name, Thomas Church is most famous for building the first prominent amoeba-shaped swimming pool. So think of a Los Angeles pool shaped like a kidney beam. Thomas Church does that in right after World War II. Thomas Church was here in Michigan. He was giving a lecture. Mr. Smith thought, "This is my chance." He goes to the lecture, and afterwards he goes up and says, "I live in a Frank Lloyd Wright house. I'm Mr. Smith. Don't you want to come and see it?" And Church sir says, "Okay, yeah, sometime, sure." And Mr. Smith is kind of dejected, but he gets a call a little bit later from California, and Mr. Church's assistant says, "Church will be in Michigan. He would like to come out and see the house. He'll be here from September 20th to 24th. Mr. Smith says, "Sure, anytime. I'll clear my calendar. When will he be here?" And the assistant says, "Sorry, you misunderstand. He would like to stay at the house for those 4 days in Michigan." And so Church does come out. He walks the ground. He falls in love with the Smiths, which everyone who visited the Smiths did. And he, on his last day here, rolls out his onion skin drafting paper on the kitchen dining room table, and he for Sara and Melvyn this new landscape plan. He calls out trees, shrubs, flowers, and he redesigns the lake in the form of an amoeba. And so Church says, you know, Mr. Smith, I can take this back to Berkeley. I can have my office draw it up. It'll be a few $1,000s. Or in appreciation of your hospitality, you can have this drawing and we'll call it a day. And I think by now you know which answer Mr. Smith took. And so I heard that story. It's in the book that was written about Mrs. Smith, but I had no proof that it was true. There's no record of Church's visit in his archive. There's no drawings in his archive, which makes sense because he didn't draw them up. And so I'm thinking, nice story. Where's the proof? As a curator, I kind of want to have that proof. Well, about 2 years ago, we had an Eagle Scout who called up Cranbrook and said, I want to be an architect. Can I do an Eagle Scout project in architecture, particularly with the house? What am I going to do with a bunch of high school guys in this house? You know, I don't think they can exactly, vacuum these tapestries. And so my registrar, Leslie Mayo, came up with this idea that they would inventory all of the Smiths' books. And so for one day in the spring, all the Eagle Scouts were here, the most nervous I've ever been for the pots. And they went through every book and inventoried it. They found so many newspaper clippings tucked into books. And then they found a book signed, Thomas Church. Thank you so much for your hospitality. You have a beautiful home, September 1957. I had the proof that he was here. A little bit later, the original guest book, which Dory had taken to her own house for safekeeping, she gave it to Cranbrook Archives, and I had both Frank Lloyd Wright's signature and Thomas Church's signature. One day, I am cleaning the house, vacuuming in the bathroom, and I get up to the soffits, and I'm vacuuming the soffits, and I see all of this stuff just back in the corner. I pull out original couch cushions, which is how we restored the fabric in the home. I pull out bedspreads. I pull out their toothbrushes and their water pick. And the bedspreads, my registrar says, that's gross, that they did not use those. Those are king size. They're in their original packaging. And I say, Mr. Smith was an army man. Everything was put back in its original packaging. So we pull out the bedspread. We unfold it. It has a big old stain on it. Leslie says, that is gross, Kevin. I say, oh, the stain will be against the wall. It's fine. We put it on, the stain is against the wall, and what does it line up with but a stain on the wall? So we know exactly when the stain occurred, and I had my proof that they used the bedspreads. We go to make the other bed, we lift it up, underneath the mattress, a huge folder that says drawings. I open the folder, and there is Thomas Church's sketch. Where in the world are you going to store a huge architectural blueprint in a house with no conventional closets? They had stored it flat underneath the mattress and the box spring. And I had my proof that Thomas Church was here, that he designed the landscape. And so now we have worked with Quinn Evans of Ann Arbor to develop a landscape restoration plan. So starting this June, we'll begin doing some of the plantings. We'll also begin restoring the driveway, working on moving the sculptures so they don't become quite so waterlogged. Over the summer, we'll do the hardscape, and in the fall, we'll plant some of the plants that need to be planted in cooler weather. So it's something to look forward to as we bring the landscape back. Not necessarily to the Thomas Church plan exactly. We're going to bring it back to how Mr. Smith, what he sort of achieved with his landscape plan. So it will be a combination of Frank Lloyd Wright's landscape design, Thomas Church's landscape additions, which include this eyebrow of junipers that are missing birch trees in the center, azaleas, and then wildflower gardens. And then we'll have Mr. Smith's changes. The lake that you're seeing out there today was actually done quite late in Mr. Smith's life. In 1982 or 3, he and the neighbors, 5 properties, went in to rebuild a much larger pond. So thank you all so much for joining us on our tour of the Frank Lloyd Wright Smith House. I hope that all of you are doing well and that you are being safe and making positive choices. I hope that all of your families are doing well, and thank you to all of our frontline workers, like my sister, who are out there keeping us safe and healthy. These live tours are every Wednesday at 5 o'clock. Next week, we will be looking at the architecture of Eliel Saarinen and Raphael Mineo at Cranbrook Academy of Art. I also want to take this moment to have a favor asked of you. Though the Frank Lloyd Wright Smith House was generously endowed by the Tobes and Ann Smith, and so this is a project that is well funded. There's no way that we can continue doing our work at Cranbrook and specifically our work at the center without your support. Much of our funding comes from tours, which we are obviously probably not doing at all this tour season, or possibly not doing at all. And so if you enjoy these tours and you are able to, we would certainly appreciate it if you went to center.cranbrook.edu/support. Any little bit helps, and we really do appreciate it. As we've reached the side of the house, we're coming across Frank Lloyd Wright's design of the gate, as well as Mr. Smith's storage. He had no shed, so his lawnmower was in the side of the house here. We're also seeing the bedroom side of the house, and then this wonderful canopy, this trellis, which has the little jacuzzi light bulbs sneaking out. And what is unique of this house, different from almost any other Usonian, are these fretted brickworks. So if the house reopens this tour season, we do tours of the house 3 Saturdays and Sundays a month, May to November, and they leave from Cranbrook. And so I hope that all of you go to the website. You can learn a little bit more. You can learn a little bit more about the house on our website. I have also an oral history interview conducted with Urban Japina, the weaver who did the piano piece, as well as some essays that I've written about Frank Lloyd Wright, the Smiths, Saarinen. Thanks so much for joining. I hope all of you have a wonderful day. I'm going to keep enjoying this beautiful spring weather as I close down the house. Be well, everyone.